Welcome to The Business. I'm Philip Lasker. Coming up on the program, pointing to the biggest budget black hole in history, but why economists say the government is not spending enough.
My estimates are that the stimulus at the moment might be $100 billion short of where it should be.
Plus, more labour pains for businesses like this, as the Treasurer predicts unemployment is set to soar.
The girls need the work, but I just don't have the hours at the moment.
The coronavirus crisis has sent the budget's bottom line plunging to an $86 billion deficit, and there's worse to come. Soaring spending to avoid a fiscal cliff, coupled with plunging revenue, is expected to see that shortfall blow out to more than $184 billion this financial year. And that's an optimistic view. It's a far cry from the $5 billion surplus Josh Frydenberg was forecasting back in December.
Today, we stand here in a very different world. Australia and the world are now experiencing the most severe economic crisis since the Great Depression.
On the upside, Australia retains its AAA credit rating and the debt blowout is much less than in the US or Europe. But unemployment is expected to be more than 9% by Christmas. Business investment is forecast to fall by 12.5% this financial year, and that's despite a pickup in mining investment. Non-mining business investment is forecast to plunge more than 19%, all of which means government support is going to be needed for some time to come. It also means today's forecast debt numbers could end up being conservative. If it was business as usual, today's numbers would have been the worst ever budget black hole in history. For years, we've been told of the debt and deficit disaster. So how important are phone book figures during the worst health crisis the world has seen? Here's Stephen Long.
It certainly put the D in deficit, but as the federal budget plunges so deeply into the red, will we all be ruined? No. It's time to bust the deficit myth.
Madam Speaker, the budget for 1987-88 is in balance.
For decades, politicians have demonised deficits and deified the budget surplus, acting as if it's the pinnacle of economic management.
In net terms, tomorrow, the government will owe nothing.
A strategy that will see the budget return to surplus in 3 years' time.
Labor's debt and deficit disaster.
We will deliver a surplus in our first year in office and every year after that.
The budget is back on track and will be back in the black for the 2019-20 year.
So much for that. But there's a strong case to say that with the economy weak even before COVID hit, a surplus was the wrong policy ambition.
What we've had in Australia is a bipartisan infatuation with budget balancing and deficit politics. And we are poorly positioned in this time of crisis to push beyond this discussion to talk about what does government need to do right now.
This simplistic, childlike notion of surplus good, deficit bad, you won't find it in the economics textbook. It's mainstream economics that government should be spending up big when the economy is weak. And the alternative doesn't bear thinking about.
The lines of unemployment became longer than those at any football final. Soon, a quarter of the workforce had no work.
The Great Depression of the 1930s is history's biggest lesson about what happens when governments don't step in during a downturn.
Looking at periods like the 1940s, whereby we came out of the 10 years of stagnation in the Depression, and what we learnt in that time was clearly in our own history, government steps forward into the void, puts people back into jobs, invests into reconstructing the economy, and we're in exactly the same position today.
The depth of this crisis is such that we're going to have to get used to these elevated fiscal deficits for many years, not just a few years, but many years.
Newcastle-based economist and academic Bill Mitchell thinks the government isn't spending enough.
My estimates are that the stimulus at the moment might be $100 billion short of where it should be.
Will we drown in debt? Unlikely. The government's borrowing at the cheapest rate since Federation, as low as 0.25%. Wouldn't you love to get a loan like that? living the dream. But old habits die hard. Already the government's looking at winding back on JobKeeper and JobSeeker. And unless there's a big pickup in employment and private sector activity, cuts to government spending risk a longer downturn. One thing's certain, the old rhetoric about debt and deficit is surplus to requirements right now.
Stephen Long with that report. Labor would dearly love to give the federal government a taste of its own medicine, using the massive debt to attack its economic competence. The emphasis, though, has been on the lack of a detailed plan to create jobs as unemployment continues rising. And it's not yet prepared to back the government's approach to industrial relations reform as a solution to the slump in business investment. I spoke to Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Jim Chalmers, thanks for joining The Business.
Thanks for having me on the program, Phil.
Well, the pandemic is unprecedented. You've got to cut the government a fair bit of slack, haven't you? I mean, it's almost impossible to predict anything.
The Reserve Bank has released detailed forecasts. The private sector's released detailed forecasts. Labor during the GFC released 3 sets of updated 4-year forecasts in a 6-month period in the worst of that downturn. And so I think it's not too much to ask for the government to release a full budget update, and their main message today seems to be that Australians have to wait a couple of months now for a proper plan for jobs, and that's not good enough either.
But the jobs situation, isn't that panning out better than we might have expected in May?
I think that's cold comfort for the million Australians who are already unemployed. And I think the other, probably the defining feature of what the government released today is their expectation that another 240,000 Australians will lose their job between now and Christmas. And all we're saying is we want to continue to be a responsible and constructive opposition, but we need a plan to engage with.
So what would you do to prevent those 240,000 jobs from being lost before Christmas?
Clearly in the near term, the government could invest in public housing. It's a good labour-intensive stimulus. There are a lot of jobs in it, and it builds something with lasting benefit and something that is good for the most vulnerable people in our society. So that's one of the ideas that we've proposed. The other thing, which you would appreciate, I'm sure, is that business investment is a big problem during this recession, but it was actually a big problem before the recession as well. One of the reasons business investment's been so weak is because there's been energy policy uncertainty. And so we want to join with the government and agree a plan for cheaper and cleaner energy. We think that would be good for business investment. And if it's good for investment, it's good for jobs.
Well, one of the things that people say might boost business investment is industrial relations reform. The government seems to want to stick with that and take the opportunity. The government would say that a lot of the jobs that have been created, particularly for young people and women more recently, has been because of the industrial relations flexibility we've been seeing around JobKeeper. So isn't that working? Isn't that something to stick with?
Well, again, I mean, we engaged really constructively when the government said let's have some temporary arrangements for the businesses which are going through such a tough time that they qualify for JobKeeper. We don't think the government has yet made the case, or a convincing and compelling case, to make some of those changes permanent. And we're a bit wary of the government here because we don't want them to use this recession as an excuse to permanently lock in things in arrangements which disadvantage workers unfairly. So we'll have a look at what the government proposes.
But let's face it, workers don't have much bargaining power at the moment, do they? It's either, do you want a job or not?
And the answer to that, I agree with that, and the answer to that is not more insecurity. The answer to that is not to try and make temporary arrangements permanent. If the government's got a proposal there, let's see it.
Do we need to worry about our debt and deficit?
Oh, look, I think the first priority is jobs. And so we've said all along, really, that we understand that the government needs to intervene here for Australians to support their jobs, try and prevent people losing a job. But the debt will have to be repaid in time. And the best way to do that is to grow the economy. We missed an opportunity today to hear a plan from the government to do that. So
you would rule out increasing taxes as a way of reducing debt?
Oh, look, we'll finalise our policies on the budget closer to the election when we know what kind of situation that we'd inherit. But our first priority and the best way to fix the budget is to fix the economy.
And in growing the economy, would Labor have spent more than the government?
Oh, look, I think clearly there's a case to be made to spend some of this money more effectively, but equally a case to consider some kind of further stimulus. That's the point that many of the expert commentators have made today in responding to this half update from the government. So those sorts of things should be considered. The priority should be jobs. Every dollar that is spent here needs to be judged against its effectiveness, and the best way to measure its effectiveness is what it means for employment.
Jim Chalmers, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Phil.
Today's mini-budget paints a dire picture of the jobs market, with hundreds of thousands more people tipped to join the unemployment queues. As JobSeeker and JobKeeper wind down from September, it's clear the private sector is expected to play a bigger role in the recovery. Andrew Robertson has been out talking to businesses that we first visited when the pandemic hit, more than 4 months ago.
Back in March, Sydney cafe owner Roddy Georges was celebrating with a business delivering record turnover.
Our tables outside were full. We had 5 staff on plus myself. 3rd week of March and it just tapered right off. You know, we lost like nearly 90% of the business.
4 months of COVID-19 later, Central Brew is struggling to stay afloat with no recovery in sight and 4 of those 5 staff members sacked.
It's a tough situation for me. The girls need the work, but I just don't have the hours at the moment.
It's a similar story at Port Douglas in Queensland, which is heavily reliant on tourism. Unemployment has soared.
I think the first 6 weeks it would have been close to 100%. Nowhere was open, everything was shut, the streets were deserted, there were no visitors.
Amelia Hannaford says tourists were slowly starting to come back to Port Douglas until COVID-19 reared its head again in Melbourne. She says the region is now facing a renewed crisis, which she believes will be made worse by the government's winding back of JobKeeper.
There will be businesses just like ours that will struggle to keep staff on the lower rate, who will not want to go into debt or not be able or willing to take on loans, who will end up laying off their staff.
With COVID-inspired layoffs at companies big and small all over the country, it's no surprise that official unemployment jumped by more than 1/3 in the June quarter to 7.4%. The Treasurer says the effective rate is more than 13%. But amongst all the COVID carnage, there are some winners, such as Medina Engineering at Chipping Norton here in Sydney's west. As a key supplier to sectors like railways, mining and construction, business is booming and Medina is hiring, not firing.
We've employed somebody up in the office to help us with the ton of inquiries that have been coming in, and then also down here on the floor we've got some new people starting, yeah.
And even if COVID lasts years and not months, which is looking increasingly likely, Jessica Uzelak is confident Medina will not be laying off its staff.
There are a lot of suppliers here in Australia that would have otherwise have sourced things from overseas, but now are looking locally to be able to get things manufactured, which is great for companies like ours.
However, while Medina Engineering looks forward to a bright future whatever happens with COVID, many others are walking a tightrope.
I'm not a quitter. I've been here for 4 months and we've survived it, so I'd like to survive it. Looking into the future, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'd like to say that I'd be here.
Perhaps an even bigger threat to jobs in inner city cafes like Central Brew and in fact businesses all over the country is that when COVID is eventually done and dusted, hundreds of thousands of people will have discovered they prefer to work from home.
Andrew Robertson reporting. To the markets, and there was